Hello and welcome to Do You See What I See? I'm Yolanda Nava. Today's guest is an acclaimed abstract artist, Michele Bonelli, who has a major exhibit up this month and into the end of May. And I must tell you that Michele Bonelli is my first cousin. So with that in mind, I am very happy to welcome Michele Bonelli. It's great to have you, Michele.
And it's great to be here, Yolanda.
We've
And
had
thank you, by the way, for
many
the
years apart.
opportunity.
I'm sorry?
I said, and thank you for having me.
Yes, and I'm pleased to have you because you're a very acknowledged abstract artist, and I wasn't aware of the seriousness of your life's work and culminating now in this wonderful exhibit that's going to take place from now until the end of May. And we'll announce that at the end of the show so that you can give the address and everything and the information about that exhibit. But I want to go back to your beginnings because I wasn't aware that you had this artistic bent as a rather young child. So you were almost born with a paintbrush in your hand because you started an interest in art very young. Tell us about that.
Well, I was in boarding school, and one of my things that I absolutely loved was being in the arts and crafts building. So all of the kids my age would go to the playground, and I would go scurrying over to the arts and crafts building, and I loved to paint. So I started out with finger painting, and then I graduated to oil paints gradually. Actually, I was doing oil paints by the time I was 7 years old. And I was doing those paint by number kits. And then I started blending and doing all kinds of things. And I started making things and building things. And I've always just had a really serious interest in it and a love of it.
So you loved art as a very, very young child, and you spent a lot of times in museums, and then you went to school, and you were fortunate to be in a boarding school, you said, where you were
I was
taking,
in I was in boarding school.
and tell us about that experience.
It's kind of a strange way to go to school, I guess, but once you get used to it, I loved it. And it gave me the opportunity to do a lot of things that I like to do. We had a swimming pool, we had horses there, we could go horseback riding. So over through my childhood, I learned a lot of things that I guess the local kids in my neighborhood where I grew up never had an opportunity to do. I learned how to shoot a gun. I learned how to shoot a bow and arrow. I learned how to row a boat. I learned how to sail a boat. I did arts and crafts, basket weaving, leather carving, all kinds of different things.
Well, those are wonderful things to learn. And I think you made the comment when we were talking on the telephone the other day that you were a middle class child with an upper class education.
Yeah, exactly. My father believed very strongly that girls should be able to support themselves even when they got married. Because if you had a bad marriage and you couldn't support yourself and you had children, you're kind of stuck. So his feeling was that you should be wherever you are by choice rather than by necessity. So I was given a very rounded education as a result of it.
Well, this is interesting because your father was my mother's brother, different fathers that they had. But mother had that same kind of not so much encouraging me to get a career, but to be wise, to learn things that would make me that would be useful in the world. You know, she taught me a lot of virtues. And so your father obviously was very wise in his own way. So tell me more about as your life developed, when did you really get serious about becoming an artist?
Well, I loved it throughout most of my childhood, and I wanted to go to school to become an artist. And I was actually given an opportunity. I didn't ever tell you this. I was given an opportunity when I was 16 to have an exhibition. I never had enough money and I always wanted more money. So my father gave me a job as a cashier in his restaurant as soon as I could legally work. And I worked on the weekends. And there were periods where it was very, very slow. So I would always bring a pad and pencils with me. And I was always sketching. But I was sketching in my way of doing things because by then I'd already developed a rather unusual cubist style that I worked in. And one day, one of the customers that came in, who could see me sketching all the time, turned around and asked my father if it would be okay to ask me about doing an exhibition. Well, by then I had no ego whatsoever. So when he asked me to do it, I was kind of thrilled at the idea of doing it, but I never put the works together to give to him.
Ah,
And it would have been a heck of an opportunity because it was in one of the very, very good areas of New York for an exhibition. And he was one of the top galleries.
wow.
So, but I never pursued it because arts for women are very difficult. It's probably the hardest of the arts for women to get into.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's a pyramid. The structure of the art world is a pyramid, and there's only a limited number of people at the very top of the pyramid, and they're generally males.
Oh, that.
So, taking that into account and the fact that it's so difficult to begin with, and I didn't really want to be a commercial artist, it didn't really appeal to me. And I liked the fine arts because I spent most of my childhood in and out of museums. I loved being in museums. And I loved kind of bringing a pad and pencil with me or colored crayons with me and sitting next to a real artist and sketching.
Well, that's you had so you did have you had a virtual paintbrush in your head as a very young child and as a young woman. So you move into your 20s and you're in love with art and you want to do something with it. So what happens then?
Well, what really happened was I was working for the airlines at the time, and I decided I wanted to get up into management. And I refused to go to college out of high school because I was not going to be allowed to go to study art. It would have to be something more practical. So I said, if it's got to be practical, I don't want to do it. So I didn't go. So by the time I hit my mid 20s, I realized that was not a very smart decision. Not a very smart decision. I can't believe I got a gazillion phones here. They're all ringing.
Yeah.
Uh, I can't keep track of them. Uh, so I went back to school and I decided I went to a business school, a college known for its business acumen. And I decided to go in as a business major and do a combined program, a BA and an MBA in 5 years, which is normally 6 years. And I figured I could swing all of my electives into my master's, into my major, and then I could roll them over into my graduate program, which would reduce my fare for going because I was paying my own way. So it'd make it cheaper to go to college, and I could graduate in half the time. Well, I ended up in a class that was a 6 credit class, which was run by the artist in residence at the main campus of the college. And at the end of the semester, she brought in an art director to speak to me and say that I could actually pretty much walk into any ad agency. And if I chose to, get a job because I already had what they consider a signature, which was uniquely mine. By then, I had developed it. And she kind of pushed me towards the arts. So I said, oh, the heck with it. And I decided to do a double major, fine arts and business, which was actually a very practical thing to do because now
Yes,
I'm
because
running a
you've been
business
entrepreneurial
while
as
I'm
an
also a
artist.
painter.
Yeah. Yeah. You've been entrepreneurial as an artist.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it just makes sense.
So you really grabbed hold of the opportunities that came your way. You experienced what a lot of women in any field feel not good enough, not prepared, because the pyramid has always, especially in our era, was always bad at the top. And yet you knew enough in your own intuitive self to pursue your passion. So what happens once you grow into that?
Well, it becomes something very different. It's not about what I call picture making. And that might seem a little strange to people because people see art as paintings. And paintings are actually the byproduct of what I do. I don't set out to make a painting. I set out to solve a question or to solve a problem. And in the process, what seems to happen is you ask a question, you set about to figure it out, and you kind of figure it out, and you're satisfied with your answer, and you walk away and you come back, and you realize through the learning process of having done it that you were asking the wrong question to begin with, because now you've evolved, and that question is now superfluous. So you've got to move on to the next question. So it's always about moving up and up and up and up, and never really reaching an end.
I think that's a very important process, I think, for anyone to go through. Because I remember when I went through my challenge of losing, sight, and I was not yet writing a book, but my best girlfriend, who was a very intelligent and wise woman, she would ask questions, well, why did this happen? Why did that happen? I said, that's not the right question. The question is, what is to be learned from this situation? So I don't know how we both got that, ask the right question, but you're doing it in art. And so what kinds of questions, for example, would you ask yourself when you look at a blank canvas?
Well, it all started out with my being told I should never do something. Okay, I'm in school, I'm a student, I have a very knowledgeable professor say, never paint in a square because it's very difficult to make a square look square. Because of the way the eye works with perspective, it always tends to make it look rectangular. So you should never work in a square if you want a square. You need to work in a rectangle if you want it to look squarish. Never divide it down the middle because it's very hard when you do that to keep it together. It usually falls apart into two parts. So all of these things kind of became curiosities for me. Well, why shouldn't I do that? What's the reason for it? So I started out with questions like that, and I actually fell in love with the square. So almost all of my paintings are square. No matter how big they get, they tend to be square, or they're composites of squares. So
But you
let's say I'm
also do
doing a very
series of
large
paintings.
piece. I did a
Okay.
mural once, which was 24 feet.
Yeah.
The mural was proportioned in such a way that it was the equivalent of 6 squares. And I was telling a story across the mural, and each square panel was in and of itself a section of the story, and it unfolded across from left to right the way you read a book, and it was linked in such a way that it became a single unified piece. But if you looked at it the way it was actually composed or structured, it actually was 6 individual panels, kind of like the way a cartoon is done, where it's in individual panels to give you the story, except these were kind of linked up to become one solid piece. But in actuality, there were 6 squares.
So in this process of asking questions and developing your 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 idea and the questions that come with that idea, you've ended up creating several series with different themes,
Correct.
such as the one that is one of the themes that's exhibited in your show that's ongoing right now called Times Square.
Correct.
Talk about how you create these multiple drawings around a theme.
Well, you have to start. You have to have a very premeditated. I'm getting tongue tied here. A very premeditated way of working, and I'm very traditional in the way I work, even though I'm an abstract painter. So I go out and I've got to do research. My research is with a camera, and I'll spend time in the area that I want to work on, or I want to kind of develop into a series of works, or see if it's potential for a series of works. So I'll go out and I'll shoot 2, 4, 6, 800 pictures. I'll then print them. I'll lay them all out, and I'll look to see if there's anything unifying about the areas that kind of is suggestive of that area. And then I'll kind of organize them to try to find the forms of the shapes that I need. And then I use and rely on those shapes in order to get the sense of the area that I'm trying to depict. So, but nothing actually is really real in terms of what I'm painting. It's suggestive. It's bits of buildings, it's bits of signs, it's bits of oh, actually, I have a lot of taxis in there because taxis are very synonymous with that area, vehicles going back and
Yes.
forth. So I'll have like bits and pieces of taxis, maybe towards the bottom. I have no people, I have no sky because New York is not about sky or skyline unless you're at a distance looking at it. New York is about one thing on top of another, on top of another, and things encroaching on each other and kind of crowding in on themselves. And then what is Times Square? It's a lot of billboards, which means there's going to be a lot of language there, but not necessarily real language, bits and pieces of language to kind of simulate or suggest billboards. And it
Interesting.
just kind of gets built up that way little by little. And then I begin to have certain things which get repeated throughout the series because they're very much typical of the area or they give you a sense of the area.
And so the Times Square that has a lot of action and vibrancy in it.
Right. And the paintings themselves are much more intricate than I normally paint. Because frequently I will paint as little as a primary set of colors, red, yellow, and blue, with black, white, and grays, and not have any other color in there at all when I'm working. And then other times I'll have a slightly more intricate palette, but generally my palette is fairly simple and I have a tremendous amount of white. But in the Times Square series, there's very little white other than to indicate a sense of lights and bulbs and that kind of thing. And for the most part, it's primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, which I rarely use. But that is Times Square. Times Square has all of this stuff going on
Yes.
because buildings are not primary colors. Buildings are browns and grays and beiges. So you have to have those colors in there if you're going to do an area that's encompassing that type of architecture.
That's fascinating. Now you have a series also called Alice in Wonderland. That would have been a delightful challenge.
Well, Alice in Wonderland was two things in one. There were two things I was trying to do with Alice in Wonderland. One, I was trying to find the point at which a drawing becomes a painting. Okay, drawings are generally black and white. They're generally done in pencils. They're always done on paper. Most people assume a drawing is not in color, but drawings can also be in color. They can be full color as well. So basically, what I was doing is I was using the concept of drawing, and I was using graphite suspended in oil to create an oil paint. Okay, and I was painting my grays, which were in fact very pencil-like. And then I was mixing that in and scumbling it and doing all of the different things that you would do when you were working with a pencil, but then integrating it in a painterly fashion and in a geometry to kind of make the whole thing work. So that was the one thing I was doing. And how much could I edit out color and bring in that kind of pencil-y looking paint? At which point does it fall apart? Okay, and become a drawing. Now, which point does it convert and become a painting? And what is that equilibrium that you need to have to make it work? So that was one issue. And then the other issue was to take the various scenes from Alice Through a Looking Glass and try to transpose them into a more emotional reaction to them. So it was about how does steam feel? How does frustration feel in terms of visually? Sharp versus smooth edges versus jaggedy versus teary shapes. And one of my favorite, where I think was really, really successful, is the area where I did the Great Hall. The scene where Alice is there. She's too big to get through the door to follow the rabbit. There's that little bottle of drink me to get smaller. And in order to get into the door, she needs the key. So she drinks the bottle, but forgets to take the key. So now she's little. The key is up on the table. She can't get up to the table because she's too little. And it's this kind of sense of frustration and trying to get through the door and not being able to get through the door. So in order to do that scene, for me, intellectually, I needed to create a sort of keyhole or passageway, but then structure it in such a way that you couldn't get into it visually. So as you'd see it, it would push you right back up to the surface. So it's kind of a little bit of illusion going on with the composition, mixed in with the other primary issue, which is at which point does drawing become a painting? Because all of the Alice pieces have checkerboards. They all have this painterly, pencily looking color. It's not pencil, obviously, it's painted, but it kind of gives the sense of pencil.
Well, your drawings are supposed to be absolutely lovely, that you use as the basis for some of your artwork. Those, I say, are artworks in themselves. And then you created a very masterful approach. What would you tell young students, young people, even young adults who maybe at a later age decide that they want to, move into the arts and be, a creative force in the world? What would you suggest to them?
I think the most important thing as an artist, the single most important thing, and I don't think it's being taught, is that integrity to what you believe or your vision, and to follow that vision, regardless of what's going on around you. Don't follow the train. Okay. Look for the beginning of the train and jump on the first car. So always look for the first car of the train and try not to jump onto the last car of the train, because that's the way you keep your integrity. And if you keep your integrity, I think at some point you have to succeed if you're any good.
Well, seeing is an important quality, and I think on top of seeing is discernment and be able to see beyond what we think we see.
Exactly. I mean, things are not exactly what they are. So you don't necessarily have to have sight to see.
Yeah, no, that's true. I've discovered that in my, in my journey since 2009. I think this is a fascinating subject and conversation. Tell us about the exhibit and where it's going to be located and where it is located.
The exhibit is in what they call Spanish Harlem. It's a lovely gallery. It's at 1680 Lexington Avenue at 106th Street. And it's open Wednesdays through Saturdays, 12 to 6.
What's the name of the gallery?
It's called Talle Borinqua.
Daya Bonita. Okay. Well, this is a wonderful opportunity, and I can't wait to be back there with you and experience the exhibit. And it's wonderful to see your point of view and your educational experience and the multiplicity of backgrounds that you had. Perhaps thanks to your father telling you you better go out and be able to get a job, and then learning those business skills, which are an important part of being an artist, as you've discovered.
They really are. Okay. No
Well, I
matter what
thank you
profession
so
you go in,
much.
to have a background in a little business is not a bad idea.
Yep, especially in the creative arts because they are challenging. They're very, very challenging. And being a creative has for some reason in our cultures around the world actually, always been challenging for the artist, for the creative person, whether it's music or art or other areas of creativity.
Actually, when you're in New York, we'll go to the gallery, and there are three pieces in the show that I think you will be able to see through your hands.
Okay.
What I did is I have three printing plates, which are done, they're linoblock prints, which I've done in reverse. So you can actually feel them as opposed to necessarily seeing them.
Uh-huh.
So you'll be able to get a sense of them through touch. Very interesting. A lot of people responded to them much more than I would have expected.
And why do you think that is?
I put them in to create a breathing space between the paintings. And they have a sense about them which is more aerial than landscape. But they're very unusual because they are not carved out in the normal way you would carve to do a printing. Normally, you would carve out the positive space and you would leave the negative space so that when you print, it prints the positive space in color. And what I did with these plates is I carved them in reverse. I carved away all of the negative space and I left the positive space. So they become these delicate line drawings in relief on this surface. And I don't want to print them because I don't want to get them dirty.
Well, this is a
It's hard to
creative
explain.
process, and I know we could talk for probably hours about your process and your education and about the arts in general. But I want to thank you, Michelle. I wish you all the best with this exhibit, Taller Boricua, in Upper West Side of New York. And thank you so much for joining me today. And to our
Oh, it's my
audience,
pleasure. Thank you for having me.
thank you, Michelle Bonelli. Be sure you look her up, Bonelli Studio. I want to thank you for joining me today on Do You See What I See? I'm Yolanda Nava.